But in the meantime, Austin, I say we just jump right into it, and welcome to our online tasting. And I'm really excited to try these whiskeys with you. There's a few in the lineup I've never tried, and I'm super excited. Um, please tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to be a part of High West Distillery's team, and what got you here tonight.
Well, thanks, Harmony. So, hi, I'm Austin. I am the, as Harmony said, lead whiskey ambassador at High West. I've been with the company for going on 8 years. It'll be 8 years in August. Um, Very much came to High West, kind of right place, right time. I know Harmony said you were going to ask me about the Instagram handle. That's a reference to I used to be a river guide in a former life. And I ended up at High West because we had a short rafting season. And I came back to my hometown, Salt Lake City, and just to kind of get my feet back under me. And less than 48 hours after being back in Salt Lake, I was offered a job at High West by a friend that I've known since first grade.
Cool.
And the plan was to stick around for about 3 months and then go to Montana to work at another ski resort. But well, as you can see, that plan, I didn't stick to that plan. So 8 years later, nearly 8 years later, here we are. My role at the distillery is I run the tour and tasting program. So if you ever come to High West and you take a tour, do a whiskey tasting, any of that kind of stuff, that's kind of my world. And then I also do these as well. Now I am originally from Salt Lake City, Utah. I did not grow up LDS, which is a question that always ends up coming up.
You know what's funny,
And
Austin, is I did grow up LDS.
did you? Oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're not from Utah.
No, I'm not. No, and turned 18 and ran.
No, yeah. We
Yeah.
get a lot of that out here. But so I always mention that I'm actually from Utah because I like to use that as kind of a segue into not only the story of High West, but like I like to give a little context for how big of a deal a company like High West coming into existence where we are is. Um, Utah obviously has a notorious reputation as being a very dry place, not just in terms of annual rainfall, but also in terms of our alcohol laws. And if you go back far enough, Utah was very much the opposite of what it is now. Back in the 1860s, you could make a strong case that Utah was actually the largest whiskey producing region in the US west of the Mississippi. Now, it's hard to nail down those exact numbers, of course, it being the 1860s, but in 1869, there were at least 37 federally licensed whiskey distilleries operating in Utah. Because back then, members of the LDS Church were allowed to drink. There was no formal ban on drinking in the LDS Church until about a little bit over a decade after that. It was more
Yeah,
of you were encouraged not to drink, but it was like, okay, if you did. At
yeah,
least
I
that's my
heard
understanding.
that like Brigham Young was one of the first to actually own a still in Utah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. In 1869, 5 of those 37 distilleries were actually owned by Brigham Young personally.
Awesome.
So, and then he was also the one who banned distilling in 1870. There is some debate as to whether or not his distillery stayed open after that ban. So the kind of running debate in Utah is whether or not that was a religious decision or more of a business decision to ban
Yeah.
distilling in the territory. um, but regardless of that, that is really when Utah's kind of notorious relationship with alcohol starts. There was still a lot of drinking going on in Utah back then. Not only because the other really big presence in the state at the time would have been miners. Park City, where we're based, started as a silver mining town, right? And if you spend 12 to 14 hours a day underground digging up silver ore, you're going to want to drink when you get out. So
No
there was a
doubt.
big market for alcohol there. So their Park City especially has always been a town with many saloons. It's a town that people come to for fun, to party. You know, we will hopefully continue hosting the Sundance Film Festival moving forward. And so it's really like a destination, but it started as a destination just for silver mining.
Right.
Now, Utah's kind of modern relationship with alcohol, which is a lot better than what it was when I was growing up, starts really in 2002. So when I was a kid, I wasn't even allowed to see drinks being made in Utah. We had a rule that was affectionately called the Zion Curtain, where any cocktail had to be mixed out of view of a child who was underage, right? They would have like walls in restaurants that they would go behind to make the drinks. There was also a rule that any bar operating in the state of Utah had to operate as a private club, right? So basically that law functioned as a mandatory cover charge, but they were required to have a sign on the door that said a private club for members. And if you were coming in from out of state and every bar that you went to said a private club for members on the door, you would have thought it was impossible to have a drink here.
Right.
Any of you who visited Utah before the Olympics may have had that experience. And the Olympics in 2002 was really what got the ball rolling on changing these laws. Some of those laws were kind of temporarily suspended during the Olympics because the IOC wanted to be able to sell beer. And I think when the state realized that really all they were doing was leaving money on the table, especially in a tourism-driven economy, they decided it was time to update these laws permanently. And that shift is really what opened the door for us at High West. So one thing we talk a lot about in Utah is pioneers, right? The Mormon pioneers coming out here. We have a holiday, July 24th, which is Pioneer Day, that celebrates the pioneers settling in Utah. And at High West, we like to think of ourselves as pioneers in a less stereotypical Utah fashion, whiskey pioneers, if you will. And our story really starts in 2001 when our founders, Dave and Jane Perkins, went on a tour at Maker's Mark. At the time, Dave was working in the pharmaceutical industry. He's a biochemist. And when he took the tour, he realized that if he didn't already know how to make whiskey, he certainly understood the science behind how it was made. And they were actually planning on retiring, and Dave was looking for a project to keep him busy in retirement. And they decided that opening a whiskey distillery was what they wanted to do. They just didn't know where until they came to Park City on a ski vacation. My understanding is that they came to Park City and decided that this is where they wanted to open their distillery in December of 2001, which was about 2.5 months before the Olympics came to town. So just like many great things, High West story is a story of good timing as much as it is anything else. We became a company in 2004. Took a while to get licensed. Nobody had ever applied for a license to distill spirits in Utah before. We were actually given a brewery license to make beer before the state realized that what we actually wanted to do was make whiskey. But then in 2006, we were finally licensed. And in 2007, we started off as a blender, right? At our core, High West, I think our greatest strength is blending. Pretty much everything you're going to drink today, with one exception, well, I guess technically two exceptions because it's the bourbon. Everything but our bourbon does contain High West distillate. And then some of our higher end products like the Rendezvous, the Midwinters, certainly the High Country, which is 100% High West. These are whiskeys that are majority or exclusively High West, whereas the double rye is still containing mostly sourced components. So I think the core of our strength is in our blending process. And I think the ability to, as we've gotten older and our own whiskey has come of age, to be able to incorporate that into our blends without it having a negative impact and have it actually making a positive impact and a greater depth of flavor in those spirits has really what's taken High West from being this kind of plucky young distillery out of a state that's known for pretty much anything other than alcohol into what I would consider one of the more premier up and coming brands. We've still got a long way to go to catch up with the big boys in Kentucky. But as of last year, we bottled over 3 million bottles of whiskey. and
Well,
we had distribution in 76 different countries. Uh,
that's impressive. Like you're moving pretty quickly for a young distillery, I'd say.
yeah, I would say, considering that we are not even of legal drinking age as a company yet in the United States, I'd say we're off to a pretty good start.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's start out with the
Yeah.
High Country single malt.
Yeah, so to that end, like we were saying, this was the first whiskey. That's what I happen to be drinking today too. In that we ever released at High West that was 100% in house. The High Country we distilled. We started distilling the High Country when we opened our saloon in 2009. The first batch came out in 2019. It is my personal favorite thing that we make. The thing that I think really makes this unique is that it is done in the style of a single malt scotch. There is actually no legal definition for single malt in the US. So 100% malted barley, one distillery, minimum 3-year age. I think the thing that really makes this unique in terms of the aging process is we try to get the American and Scottish kind of style in the same glass. So we're using a combination of new American barrels and used bourbon barrels from our used bourbon barrels to make this whiskey. To me, the overwhelming note on this whiskey, its kind of most distinctive character is banana. Banana
Yes.
bread, especially these kind of like tropical fruit flavors. The barley really comes through, right? You get a lot of the malt. All the barley for this whiskey is coming from southern Idaho, from right outside Twin Falls. And all of our barley is grown on one plot at a farm called Mountain Malt, and they also malt the grain for us. We're using predominantly base malt with a combination of chocolate and caramel malt in there as well to add a little depth. Really, my favorite thing we make. A really fantastic whiskey. I think you could put this up in a lineup against a lot of different single malt scotches, and I don't know if it necessarily would come out as the favorite because I am a scotch drinker at the end of the day. So there are some scotches out there that I really really love and have a hard time picking anything over, but I think would hold its own in any single malt tasting. I certainly in an American single malt tasting.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
it's
cheers.
cheers. Yeah, it's definitely got an approachable nose to it. Definitely tons of banana, kind of pastry breadiness to it, which is really nice. The palate's actually got some nice sweetness. Finishes are like malty and kind of chocolatey, like for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
That
maybe
chocolate malt really
it's
comes out on
malt.
the finish, I find. I think you get like on the palate, you do get that caramel from those new American barrels. You get a little bit of oakiness, I think, from the used barrels. Um,
And you're
I mean, it
using your
really.
own barrels, I'm assuming, like you're not
Mhm.
bringing in other finished finishing casks or anything.
Absolutely, yeah. And
Nice.
in this, speaking of finishing casks, in this year's release, or I should say last year's release, in the 2023 release, we did use some used sherry barrels as well. A very
Oh,
small amount of used sherry to bolster the fruit in there a little bit.
nice.
I think that the majority of the character is really coming from those new and used American barrels, and
Absolutely.
really the barley is coming through. And I think that was the goal with this, right? Is we wanted, we often say that the difference between Scotch whiskey and American whiskey, I mean, one of the differences is that in the Scotland, they really want the work of the still to shine through. Whereas in
Right.
the States, we're focused a lot more on maturation and like the
Okay.
barrel. And we
Mm.
wanted to have both of those. And I think we did a really good job of like letting the barley shine through, letting the work that our distillers are doing shine through. Um, but then also have it taste like an American whiskey.
Yeah. Yeah. Evan says it's his first time trying this. It's drier on the finish versus other American single malts. Doesn't go sweet and cloying as expected. Nice earthy spice and pepper notes, and banana peppers is something that he gets specifically. So I think that's a cool note. I can
Yeah.
totally understand that banana peppers kind of thing. It
Oh, absolutely.
kind of reminds me at a distance of being by like an olive bar when you're like walking by like the bread bakery slash olive bar. You're just kind of heading out. You're not in it, but it's there.
Yeah.
Um, which is cool. No, it's really enjoyable. And I didn't read the alcohol level on it. 44%, not bad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that is the lowest alcohol percentage that you'll see from High West on any of our aged products. Are
And so
usually
why
our
did you go with
baseline
that?
is 90. My understanding is just that when we were going into the blending, that was really the proof at which not to say that our distillate is sharp, but I think that they were with the blenders being used to like new barrel distillate. I think it came across a little bit sharp at that higher proof, and we just felt like it sat better at 88. As we often say at High West, we let the whiskey tell us what it's going to be. That's a big part of the process when you lean into blending as your strength, right? And so I think this is an example of that, where they didn't want to force it to be a 92 when they thought it sat better at 88.
For sure. Yeah, no, and that's cool. Like, I mean, if that's where you want your product to be enjoyable and appealing to a wider audience. So sometimes you have to make those adjustments for the sake of the whiskey, not just your ego, right? Like, oh, we wanted to put it at 100 proof, but nobody likes it. It's better to tame it down, perhaps. And so is this you're saying it's 3 years, or what's the age on it? If there's no definition for single malt, how does your definition vary?
So for us, because there's no legal definition in the States, right? So we just stick to the Scottish regulations.
Okay.
Our master distiller, still house manager, our founding distiller, really all the people that run our distilling team got master's degrees in brewing and distillation at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
So Scotch whiskey in
3
terms of
years.
a production style is really at the core. So we just do 3 years because that's what they do in Scotland. That said, it's maxing out at 9, right? We're looking at a 3 to 9 year range. We don't do age statements on anything we make because those do fluctuate. But on this year's release, you're looking at a 3 to 9 year blend.
That's cool. Very nice. Yeah, I like that. I think you guys did a good job. I haven't had a ton of exposure to American single malts, but I think there's few that do it well. But I appreciate the trying that's being done. Like you got to try. I love single malt, so give it a go. I think my second favorite whiskey is probably rye. Like I really love rye, and if I drink bourbon, I usually find that it's a very high rye bourbon, which is the rye is what I was introduced to in High West probably 10 years ago, and that's what kept me around for sure, is the rye.
And that's certainly what we're best known for at High West. And in addition to being a native Utahn, is one of the things that's really kept me at High West. When I went to Scotland in 2019, I asked every distillery that I went to if they could give me a job, and the response pretty much across the board was that I had the wrong accent. So working at an American distillery that makes rye whiskey in my home state is like the next best thing.
Yes, exactly. Your accent is perfect for that state, right? Very cool. All right, well, let's go on to the High West bourbon. This is a fantastic whiskey, 46%, which is great. And the price point here in Alberta is just fabulous. I had an agent, not of your brand, just an agent who was visiting, who said I turned him on to High West, and he's now on his 5th bottle. So
nice.
We're not going to mention a time frame at all, but it's a good start. Yeah.
We never mention time frames in polite company with whiskey bottles, right? But with the bourbon for us was, I mean, there was kind of two sides of this story, right? Where Dave, I think, would tell you that he wanted to make bourbon whiskey because if you're an American distillery, people kind of expect you to. But when Brendan, our master distiller, or really founding distiller at this point, he's kind of in the process of moving on to his next project. But when he talks about the bourbon, he talks a lot about it being a way for us to use more creativity, to showcase our blending prowess. It allows us to not be shoehorned as just a rye whiskey distillery. This whiskey is our second best seller after the double rye. And I think of it as a very classic American bourbon whiskey, right? It is a combination of several different mash bills. As we mentioned, this is the only thing we make that is entirely sourced at this point. We have been doing a lot of bourbon distillations over the course of the last couple years, including a blue corn bourbon, which I don't know if it's going to go to market, but we've been playing around with a lot of different stuff.
I've heard
Last,
rumors of blue corn as like early as last fall.
mm-hmm.
Uh, I was hoping it was going to come out with the new Midwinters, but I guess it did not. That's okay. I know you're also working with red corn and other things.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm. And that one, one thing that we are always letting our stuff age for usually, I mean, at least 2 years legally in the US. So the first batch of blue corn bourbon legally can't even come out of a barrel until I think next year around this same time. So we need a little more time on that, and we don't want to rush that one, right? Blue corn is not quite as sweet as yellow corn, so it can take a lot more of that barrel influence. But our main thing with bourbon is we don't want to rush into putting anything into a bottle that isn't 100% up to our standards, right? And this whiskey, to me, is really the showcase of what we do with blending. Our blending team has had times where they've gone through as many as 80 different recipes just to make this whiskey taste the same every time. It is an incredible. Oh, go ahead.
No, sorry. I know that a lot of your sources, like source bourbon, comes from MGP. You do the 95%. And you said this was a blend. So how many, I guess, styles of blends typically go in, or do you calculate that even, or is it just based on flavor? What are your do you have like 3 core recipes that you're constantly ordering and blending, or how does that work for this product?
Yes, there are a couple core recipes. There's one from MGP that is one of their not like super high rye, but higher rye mash bills that we're sourcing a lot of for this. Now, with that said, the number one priority for this product is consistency, is flavor. Going back to what we were saying earlier, the reason we don't use age statements at High West is because for us, flavor, quality, and consistency are more important than a number, right?
And I would agree. Each statement doesn't mean it's better. And climate too, it can play a huge part, and barrels. Like I've had 3-year-old whiskey that knocks my socks off. I've had 12-year-old whiskey that just disappoints. So I don't personally feel like an age statement is a reflection of quality or flavor.
100%. And as you're going to see more of our juice going into these blends, you're going to see a lot more relatively young whiskeys that are bringing a big impact, right? Because to your point of climate, in Utah, we age really fast, right? We have really dramatic temperature fluctuations. It's very dry. So we lose more water to evaporation than we do alcohol. So we're concentrating a lot of those like alcohol soluble flavors. We're getting a lot of barrel influence really, really quickly here. And so as a result, we are going to be using younger stuff in these blends that is super impactful, right? A lot of the older stuff that you'll see from High West in these blends is about 7 years old. But with this one, it's really about, to me, creating a classic, sessionable bourbon whiskey that does not break the bank, right? Especially in the modern bourbon economy, to find a bottle of whiskey that I know where we live, it's routinely under $40 a bottle, is harder and harder to do every year, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, for us, High West was out of the market for a little while. And I mean, a few dusty bottles of rye kicking around, but the bourbon hasn't been seen for quite some time. And I was really happy to see it come back into into Alberta on our shelves at a very reasonable price. I think we sit around $55, $56 a bottle.
Oh, nice.
Canadian, which is not a normal price range for bourbon here. Like there's a lot of brand new stuff hitting the shelves and it's, 80 to $150. And what is it?
Yeah.
It's all sourced, right? Not a
Hmm.
lot of it is is their own. So I'd say for not being your own, just blending it together. I really enjoy this bourbon. I think I've made old fashions with it and just holds up really well. In the comments, there was lots of comments on the orange and cinnamon, um, kind of spicy, fruity profile. And I agree. I get a little bit of like grapefruit zest and
Hmm.
some nice like nut, like almond skins, walnut skins.
Yeah.
uh, yeah, and like yeah, even like I don't know, I'm getting like it's opening up very fruity. Like for me, it's
My one of my big ones on this is always fresh apple. I always get this really nice note of fresh apple. We often
mm,
refer to it as caramel apple when we're doing tastings because I mean it's bourbon. You're gonna get caramel notes, right? I always say that's the easiest when people ask me what's a way to like make it look
yeah,
like they know what they're talking about in a tasting. Just say bourbon tastes like caramel and vanilla, and
exactly.
you'll look like you know what you're talking
Vanilla,
about, right?
oat,
And it will, yeah,
apples. Yeah,
yeah.
genius.
But to me, yeah, a lot of apple, cornbread. I think
Mm.
the grain comes through a lot on this one.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really nice. Is there a decent amount of rye in here? Because the finish to me is a
Mhm.
little bit rye like.
Yes, the MGP component is a higher rye mash
Yeah.
bill. Yeah.
Mm, that's nice.
And then we like to use our like one thing we do a lot of, and I'm just going to use this as a little transition. A lot of at High West is finishing, right? Like I think
Yeah.
the whiskey that really took us from being like just another young upstart distillery who was doing a good job with rye whiskey into High West is the Midwinter Night's Dram, which we're going to try here in a sec. But
Hmm.
we really leaned into that finishing as part of kind of this like bigger surge of creating more unique products to put on the shelves. We do a lot of barrel finishing, and this rum barrel finish that you guys have
Yeah.
is one that I really enjoy. These are barrels that we really love at High West. Specifically, they're from Barbados, and Barbados rum, Barbadian rum, I should say. Uh, I always really directly compare it to Jamaican rum, really heavy molasses influence, right? It's more of a like kind of British colonial style rum than say like the agricole rums you get out of like former French colonies.
Mhm.
And as a result, it really amps up the sweetness, right?
It
It
totally
does
does.
also amp up the spice to me a little bit. I get a little bit of that baking spice, like a little bit of like cinnamon, maybe a touch of clove. You're getting a lot of brown sugar. You're getting this dried fruit character,
Mhm.
um, and you do get like almost like a little touch of tropical fruit on there, and
Oh,
you do taste the
definitely.
rum, right?
And
Like you get
there's
that
like a
sweetness.
dried banana, dried mango
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing, like fleshy fruits that it's really nice. And the rum comes across, but you still smell the whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't overpower, right? It still tastes like bourbon whiskey, but it has that added layer of rum to it.
Yeah. Watchman 999 says that rum finish is nice with the heavy vanilla burst.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, that is really nice. Grand Marnier with a dash of mint.
Ah,
That's a nice note, Evan.
I like that.
Yeah, this is my first time trying this. 50%, 100 proof. That's nice.
Yeah. And that's that was a thing that we've done, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the midwinters as well. But from the onset, High West, when we were just a blender, what's a thing you can do right out of the gate if you're blending whiskeys to create something unique and different? Buy some wine barrels, right? Buy some rum barrels, sherry casks. We worked with a lot of different. I've seen double rye finished in a gin barrel before. We've been there's been some rumors of tequila barrels being used in the future. There's nothing is really off the table for us. I One of my all time favorites is We did a version of our Rendezvous Rye that was finished in a Tokai barrel, which is a Hungarian dessert wine. So we're really getting out there when it comes to finishing. We've had some over the years that I've tried that didn't work out as well as we wanted them to. You know, we did a double rye in a peated Scotch barrel. I described it as tasting like burning spearmint, which was not my favorite tasting note ever, but you know, you're never going to know unless you try it, right?
Like on fire, or it was just so minty that it was burning?
Like if you took a pile of spearmint and lit it on fire.
Yeah. Oh, gross.
Yeah. But you know, one thing, we're really big on experimenting, right? Like, you know, as we'll talk about again with the Campfire, breaking unwritten rules is not a thing that we have a problem with, right? We opened a distillery in Utah. So for us, it's all about like, there's no reason to write something off if we haven't already tried it. So we're going to try anything that comes to mind. And then if we find out that it didn't work, at least we can say we tried, right?
Awesome.
Now, into our next one, this was probably our most successful experiment. Double rye is easily our best-selling whiskey, right? And when we first started, I know in Canada, y'all have a different kind of perception of rye whiskey than we did in the United States. But in the United States, like really up until about 15, 20 years ago, rye whiskey was very much looked at as cheap hobo whiskey, for lack of a better term. Like it was the whiskey you drank if you couldn't afford to buy cheap bourbon.
Like cheap Canadian whiskey.
I mean, I'm not going to disparage Canadian whiskey, but no, like it was very much looked at as like the cheaper alternative to bourbon, which is wild because for most of American history, before Prohibition, rye dominated the American whiskey market. Like if you look at traditional American cocktail recipes, they are all made with rye, right? Bourbon really does not become what we know it as today until after the repeal of Prohibition. And I think it has a lot to do, and there's a lot of theories with this, but I think it has a lot to do with kind of the change in palate in the United States that American whiskey or American drinkers, if you weren't lucky enough to be close to Canada, like if you were in Chicago or Detroit, you were drinking Canadian Club, right? If you were in even New York, or if you were in Los Angeles, if you were in Texas, even getting that was a hard thing to do. You're drinking bathtub gin, moonshine, stuff that was really bad, really rough. And so cocktails became really a necessity, right? You really see this kind of proliferation of cocktails in the American culture during Prohibition. And so as a result, I think that the palate shifts to bourbon because it's a sweeter whiskey. But double rye to me is indicative of what a more traditional, double rye and Rendezvous are really indicative of a more traditional American whiskey. Double rye was a gamble in the sense that we were making a rye whiskey that was intended to be, and I'm quoting Dave here, the spiciest rye in the world. Right? We wanted this whiskey, the focus of the blend has always been on rye as a grain and the spices and the botanicals that come from a grain forward rye whiskey. Early batches of double rye, Dave would use cinnamon red hots as a tasting note. I would not describe it that way anymore personally. I think it's become much more balanced over the years as we've introduced our own. So we're getting, we're getting the 95% rye, 5% malted barley mash bill from MGP, which if you're a whiskey nerd, I'm sure you are very familiar with the MGP 95.5. I would say that's the whiskey that really has come to define modern American rye whiskeys. Our in-house rye, which is distilled out of a hybrid pot still that is based around a traditional Scottish pot, is a 80% rye, 20% malted rye mash bill. So you're really getting rye here, right? Like that 5% malted barley and that MGP juice, that's there for purely scientific reasons to help facilitate the mashing process during the production. But the flavor profile of this is rye, right? Cinnamon, clove, gin botanicals, juniper, eucalyptus. I always get this really distinctive mint note on it. But it's not hot. It's spicy. It's bold. It's got big flavor, but it's not hot. It doesn't bite you. To my dollar, and in the United States, this is routinely under $40 a bottle. And I have said time and time again, you will not find a better American rye for under $40 a bottle in the United States. Like
Yeah.
you just, it's Bullet is like the other option, and then there's Rittenhouse, but within that same price point, those are really the only competition that we have.
Yeah.
And I hear time and time again in major cities when I go to cocktail bars that double rye is the go-to rye for them.
Yeah. It definitely has a dill and very floral. Black licorice note has come out. I've also like, this isn't a bad thing, but it kind of reminds me of like a pond on a farm that I grew up on. It's like it's got this kind of like wet soil and grassiness. Reminds me of a pond. Um, and Jeff wants to know if Dickel Rye is anything that it would be in comparison to in the States. I'm not sure if it's in the same price point.
Yeah, I would say Dickel Rye definitely falls in that same category. My understanding, and don't quote me on this, but my understanding is that Dickel Rye, much like Bullet and the source component in Double Rye, is that same 95.5 from MGP. And so they're really comparable side by side. I personally like the High West a little bit better, but I'm also legally required to say that. So, but yeah, Dickel Rye is fantastic rye.
Yeah. Totally will. I get a peppercorn finish on the rye. Its palate is very smooth, and that's been said in the tasting chat there as well. It's very smooth, and I see why this is such a huge component in your bars and saloon, like why it's put into so many cocktails and why people enjoy it. It's very nice.
Yeah, I always say, like, I call Double Rye my Swiss Army knife because it's great in cocktails. It's great on its own. It's a reasonable enough price point that if you drink more than you were planning on, you're not going to feel guilty about it. Like, it just kind of checks all the boxes.
Yes.
And for me, it really comes down to at the price point. I think there's a lot of other great rye whiskeys out there. Another one that comes to mind is like the Piggyback from Whistle Pig as like a younger, more affordable product. So I will rephrase that as saying, I don't think you're going to do better than Double Rye. You might find something as good, but at the price point, you're not going to do better.
Yeah. Lime jujubes on the nose showing up now for this Double Rye, and Evan said it would kill in a mint julep.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, very cool. I wish I made cocktails. I never have all the ingredients, and I'm always afraid I'm going to screw it up. But your distillery, just going back to something that sets you apart from a lot of other distilleries, is you're the first or only ski in, ski out distillery. Is that true?
Yeah, I'm not going to say only anymore because when High West first started, there were, I think, there were under 100 distilleries, whiskey distilleries in the United States. Now there are over 500, and ski towns are notoriously heavy drinking places, as I'm sure you're all well aware. So I don't want to say we're the only one, but we were the first. At least in North America, we were the first ski in, ski out gastro distillery. If y'all are ever in Park City, come see our flagship location at 703 Park Ave at the High West Saloon. It's actually a remodeled horse livery from the early 1900s. And that is why our logo is a horseshoe, right? Is because when we were first remodeling that building, it used to be a horse livery, so we found a lot of horseshoes underneath the floorboards, and we took that as a good sign. We took that as a lucky horseshoe, and so far that's proven to be true. Yeah,
that's really cool. I found a horseshoe gardening at my grandparents' bed and breakfast. They rescued and revived an abandoned 1930s home/school. in a small town in Alberta, and it had sunk like 4.5 feet into the earth, and they had to raise it up. And I was digging through the gardens and found some horseshoes, and that home was built by horses drawing these large beams from a bridge that was taken down and rebuilt for the train line. So they had these giant pillars and beams that were dragged by like 2 or 3 workhorses at a time, like 10 miles to get to the home, and was built on. So when I found that horseshoe, I thought it was pretty lucky. It was
Oh
very
yeah.
rusty.
Yeah, they get very rusty.
Yeah. Very cool. So the next one is your Rendezvous Rye.
Mhm.
Um, which,
So, we talked about like philosophy and blending, right? Rendezvous was our first ever release. Back when we put out Rendezvous for the first time, you could just go to MGP and buy 16-year-old rye whiskeys, no problem, right? You could just walk in the door and leave with thousands of gallons of 16-year-old, 10-year-old, just really old rye whiskeys. These days, when you buy whiskey from MGP, you buy the unaged distillate and you tell them how long you want them to let it sit for. So Rendezvous, as a result, started off as a very mature blend of ryes. The earliest blends would have been a range of ryes going from 2 to 16 years old. Huge, huge range. These days, it is still the focus of that blend. The way our blenders like me to talk about it is on the barrel. Whereas double rye, the focus is on the grain. Rendezvous, the focus is on the barrel and the impact that it has. Rendezvous is majority High West. Before anybody asks, we do not quote ratios purely because they change so regularly.
yeah.
This is something that is going to be different every year. We switched from having it available year round to doing a once annual release of the Rendezvous. It's easier to find than some of our other annual releases, certainly than like the Midwinter Night's Dram or this High Country Single Malt.
Mhm.
But it is something that's different every year, right? But the focus is always on the blend or on the barrel itself, right? So what I say with rye is when you age rye whiskey in the barrel, you tend to lose some of those botanicals, but you're amplifying spice, you're bringing in more sweetness. To me, toffee, orange peel. I always get this like kind of like I think of like a piece of toffee that has like almonds crumbled on top of it. You get a little bit of like kind of creamy nuttiness. A lot of spice, cinnamon,
Yeah.
clove. I get like this kind of nutmeg note, like a bright, like think like fresh grated nutmeg, right? That bright,
Yeah.
almost citrusy kind of nutmeg. And to me, that's like I love the comparison of these two whiskeys because you really are just showing in practical terms, in terms of raw flavor, what is the barrel doing to a whiskey. One of the reasons I love rye whiskey, is that I think it transforms in the barrel in a way that bourbon does not.
Mhm.
Which is not to say bourbon does not transform, but there's this change that happens in the flavors where you're really transforming it into something new. If you ever had rye whiskey straight off of the still, it is minty, botanical with a little bit of spice. And some of the compounds in the barrel really amplify those spicy notes, and they really add a lot of sweetness. And I think the Rendezvous is a really good example of that. It is still our flagship whiskey. It's the first thing we ever released. It's actually named after, before the Mormons even came to Utah, the earliest Europeans that were trading here would have been mountain men, fur trappers, and they would have had mountain men rendezvous. The first records that we have of mountain men rendezvous in Utah are in 1826, so nearly 20 years before the Mormons settled in Salt Lake Valley, and they would have been trading whiskey more than they would have been trading money, right? They would have been trading pelts and furs and whatever else, whatever the resources they were pulling out of the mountains for whiskey more often than cash. Because, I mean, let's be real, if you're living in the mountains,
Gosh, is
you
not.
don't have it has no purpose. I mean, at that point, this was still Mexico, right? And
Absolutely.
so these guys were not bound by any country, and the American currency or Mexican currency would not have been any use to them. They would have wanted whiskey. Whiskey was a cure for the common cold. It was a libation. It was an antiseptic. It could be used in a pinch to start a fire, right? It had so many applications. And so we often say the first whiskey markets in the West were Mountain Man Rendezvous, and that's where the name for this whiskey came from originally.
Yeah. I find this one a lot more minty than the first rye. Like initially it was like all mint and spice. But I don't know. Now it's tamed down now that I had a sip.
Mm-hmm.
And the cinnamon's not quite as there, but the Rendezvous is somewhere between buttered tarts with raisin and a light roasted coffee cake, says Will. That's a nice note. You're malting all of your rye in this?
So for the Rendezvous, it's that 80-20. 80% raw rye, 20% malted rye.
Mm.
And interestingly enough, the malted rye does not provide a usable amount of enzymes for the production process. It's there for depth and texture. It adds a lot of body to the distillate. Especially, we use a hybrid pot still, so it's a Scottish pot that feeds into a very small rectifier. And it allows us to maintain a lot of the texture and depth that we're developing in our fermentation process. And so that's why we use that added 20% malted rye, is to add body and depth.
Yeah, I like the idea personally of and I like the mouthfeel of an unmalted rye. It's a little greener, a little fresher, a little earthier, and I really enjoy it. And I'm starting to look for, I'm doing my research when I look at ryes to see how they're preparing it before distillation, because I just enjoy it personally. So
yeah, and we're lucky to be where we are in terms of grain sourcing, because though Utah is a terrible place for growing grains, most of our agriculture here is based around ranching. We are right next to Idaho, and there's a farm in southern Idaho that is less than a 5-hour drive from our distillery, and they have two plots that are set aside specifically for High West. So they only grow rye at one, and they only grow barley at the other, and they only sell that rye and that barley to High West.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Comparing the two, the double rye feels butterier at this moment than the Rendezvous. And I thought initially I would feel differently, but just my initial notes are, it feels richer, but could be a residual Rendezvous in my sinuses though. But they're both like, they're so different, which is really cool that you can create something so different, both of rye at one distillery, which is very nice. Now, another rye in your portfolio, although limited, is your Midwinter's Night Dram. And I remember my first encounter with this whiskey, not because I drank it, but because the phone at work would not stop ringing, and everyone was looking for it. And I think it was 8 years ago or so, it was like the first time it ever came to Alberta. And there had already been multiple releases in the US. So the ratings had been out there, and it's just like everybody had known about it. We'd never had an opportunity to get it. And I remember everybody just going bonkers wanting to try it, which I thought was really interesting because it was still at a time when nobody seemed to give a shit about rye, but everybody wanted to try this, this Shakespearean rye, which is really cool. Evan
I really like.
Evan, sorry, in the chat, Evan said Midwinter's is the Shakespearean pappy.
I was just gonna highlight that same thing, and the reason why is that at High West we call this our pappy, right? This is the whiskey that people line up around the block to try. It is easily our like most classic of all of our whiskeys, right? This is, I mean, to me, it's the whiskey that took High West from being another young upstart distillery into the company that we see today. And I think this is, I mean, the best example that we have of what we do here in terms of finishing, right? And then just to double check, are you guys having the Act 11? Is
Yes.
that what is? Okay, cool. So I asked because though the Act 10 was incredible, and the response that we had for the Act 10 was insane. On release day for the Act 10, we had a line that was out the door around the block. We had a line going to the saloon that was, I think, 5 blocks long. The average wait time to get a bottle was about 4 hours. It was crazy. It was absolute madness. And that one to me was a really great whiskey. And the thing, what Midwinter's is, right, is it is Rendezvous Rye finished in a combination of ruby and tawny port barrels. When I first started at High West, we were buying those barrels from Napa Valley. So they were like port barrels. These days, we do source them directly from Portugal. And I think with the Act 10, the thing that really made it stand out was that there were some components in that blend that had finishes as long as 10 years. 10 years, excuse me, 2 years. But
wow.
Yeah, I was thinking the 10-year anniversary. That's where that number popped into my head. But with the Act 11, we kind of went back to our roots with it, and it is a year in those used barrels, in those port barrels. And to me, it has this, I mean, the classic notes of the Midwinters are certainly, you get those rye spices, right? But then you get this, I mean, plum, fig, I always get this like gingerbread, kind of like cookie flavor,
Definitely.
cherry. But to me, there was this one note that really stood out to me this year, and I don't know if everybody else will get this, but cranberry to me, it had this brightness, this acidity to it that I hadn't seen in the Midwinters in years, and it added this like just extra layer that like to me really livened it up and made it to me a real standout. And I started at High West with Midwinter Night's Dram Act 4, which if I had known what this whiskey was going to become, I would have bought a lot more bottles of the Act 4 when I had the chance. But I think that at this point I'm qualified to say that this is one of the best releases of the Midwinter Night's Dram we've had, at least to my palate. I think it's a really, 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 really cool whiskey.
Are you talking about 10 still or the 11?
I'm talking about the 11 now. Sorry.
Okay,
so this one, switching to the Act 11, that one to me was actually, from my palate, more of a standout than the Act 10. That it had this brightness to it, that it had this little bit of acidity that just kind of added a little bit something more to it. To me, it was a little bit more exciting. It reminded me more of the Midwinters from the first couple years that I was with the company. So it may just be nostalgic for me, but this one to me was really a standout. I definitely stocked up on the Act 11 when it was available because I knew that this was going to be a favorite of mine for years to come.
Very cool. So on the label, it has Act and Scene.
Yes.
So what are the differences of that? Can I get like an Act 11 Scene 10, Scene 9? Like, how are those done?
So in theory, within each act, the scenes should taste the same.
Okay.
Because the act is related to the year of the release, right? So the Act 10 is the 10th year that we had done it. Act 11, what you guys are trying, is the 11th year of our release, or the 11th release of the Midwinter Night's Dram. And the scene is the day of bottling, right? Or the batch. And so in theory, within each of those acts, those scenes should be the same.
Okay.
Right? Because they're the same blend, same big batch with just a smaller portion of that. With that being said, I have done vertical tastings of scenes within an act, and I have had some people say that everyone tastes the same, and I've had some people say that they're noticeably different. And so maybe some people's palates are more refined than others. maybe somebody really wants it to be different, and so they find a difference in it.
Right.
But in theory, at least the blend, the core products that are going into that are the same. Any
Hmm.
differences that are there may have to do with like
Oxidation and
oxidation. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, this is very cool. The port wines like really come through, and not to say that it tastes like wine, but just like the juiciness, the fruit, um, that juicy mouth watering experience that hasn't happened for me on the previous two ryes. Like it's just,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, just like very luxurious. And it just has a very long finish. That's just, it's different than the other two. The other two finishes are very like spice driven, where this one is just like more juicy fruits.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like your plum and cherry notes. I could see cranberries as well coming through here, which is really nice. I saw somebody posted chocolate maraschino cherries as their finishing note, and it's really cool. I was looking through my bottles and I found this one, and it's a batch seven,
Oh,
Act 7, Scene 5. And I haven't opened it, and I'm like tempted. I got to do a side by side on another day where I haven't had 5 whiskeys already.
yeah. If memory serves, I may be off by a year, but if memory serves, that was the first year that our own juice went into the Midwinters.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this glass, though I am drinking single malt, is from the release for the Act 11. So,
Oh, nice. Nice glass. Yeah.
yeah, they're fun, right?
Yeah.
We take glassware very seriously at High West.
As you should. It should be Glencairn all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then all of our bottles, these were originally designed by a little family down in Guadalajara in the really early years of High West. If you have some old releases, they're actually hand blown bottles.
Hmm.
And we didn't want to sever that relationship. So we actually still, all if you come to the saloon or to the refectory, which is our main distillery location, that's where I work, and you get a cocktail, it comes in a glass that is still hand blown by the family that helped us design the bottles in the first place.
That's cool. I
Um,
love how the bottles like look faulted. Like there's little
mhm.
bubbles and specks in it, and they're just beautiful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the people who make our bottles call them the perfectly imperfect bottle,
Well, they're
which is very
100%
cute.
correct. Yeah, exactly. Very nice. Mm.
Well, I
Mm.
guess. I mean, I don't want to rush you guys out of the midwinter, so we can sit with that for a second longer.
No, no,
Um,
that's okay. That's okay. We can now. I mean, I guess before we do that, I think I forgot to post Evan's wanting campfire. Hold on, Evan, before we get there. We just had a couple of the well, we'll talk about the midwinters. We have some midwinters nights dram that we've been holding back for this tasting. So if you're a part of this tasting and you would like to buy a bottle of a midwinter's night dram, you can email me, and depending on how many emails I get and how many bottles, I'll just give you the bottle, or I'll raffle to see who can buy. I think we also have 4 bottles of the rum cask bourbon that we held back as well, because there was just a small allocation of those that came in. So yeah, if you're interested, you can email me. Um, and I should probably put in another password in the chat group, just because we are live and I don't want other people who weren't participating to take it on. So I'm not going to do the same password as before, because apparently that was confusing. But I'll put a password in the chat, and just email me with the password, and I'll know that you are part of this group. That said, prices are in the chat. My email's in the chat. Thank you, Evan. Let's move on to the campfire, which is one of my, like, I probably my favorite in the lineup tonight, like from what I've had. We'll discount the ones I haven't had, but just a classic whiskey for a single malt fan. This is fabulous American whiskey.
Yeah, and one of my personal favorites as well. I know Evan said when we were meeting before the tasting that this was the whiskey that really turned him on to High West. And I love peated whiskey. As anybody I'm sure in this room knows, it's a polarizing flavor profile. I always like to tell just a little story background on Campfire because I think it's really cute. So the inspiration for creating this whiskey came to our founder, Dave, who we've mentioned a couple times now. And he was when he first decided to open High West, he went to a lot of other distilleries. He went to Kentucky, he went to Scotland, he went to Canada, he went to Ireland. He went to all these places to learn about what made the actual physical locations special and to see what other people were doing. He really did his research. Also gave him a good excuse to take a vacation as a work expense, right? And so he was specifically, when the idea for Campfire came to him, he was sitting at Brooklady in Scotland on the island of Islay. And he was drinking one of their peated whiskeys next to the bay with a pairing that was cantaloupe wrapped in prosciutto with a peated Scotch drizzle, like a peated Scotch syrup drizzle. And of all things, when he tried this combination, what it made him think of was sitting around a campfire in the deserts of southern Utah, drinking bourbon next to the fire, right?
Awesome.
And that's a big thing for us here in Utah. I think there's a couple of things that come to mind when you think of Utah. One is obvious. We've talked about it a little bit. Skiing certainly is another one. But I think the other one is the deserts, right? The southern Utah deserts. Camping in southern Utah is a big part of why all of us live here. And so to him, it brought him right back to like the reason that he lived here, right? Which I can tell you when I was in Scotland, I that was not where my mind was at all. So I think it's really cool that Dave was so infatuated with the magic that is the Utah desert, that was where his mind went, sitting in the North Atlantic.
Yeah, you're sitting in Scotland and you're thinking about home.
Yeah. And so what he wanted to, in that moment, he was like, I want something that's sweet and smoky. And then I think as rye became part of our identity, that immediately became the final piece. Oh, hi, dog. And so when Campfire was released, it was the world's first commercially available blend of bourbon, rye, and Scotch whiskey. Before you ask, I can't tell you where the Scotch comes from, beyond that it's from Scotland. It is a blended malt Scotch, so I know it comes from multiple distilleries, which would just not make things any easier. The bourbon in there is MGP, and the rye in the current release of the Campfire is 100% High West. So we have finally moved to a point where the rye is 100% us. Obviously, the Scotch will never be 100% us, and the bourbon maybe someday, but currently the rye is 100% us. The one thing I can tell you about the ratio of this blend is that the Scotch is the minority component, right? So as you know, with peat, it has a lot of presence, right? You don't need a lot of peat for it to make a big impact. And I think this is a really great example of that. I'm loving some of the tasting notes that I'm seeing here. Hickory maple bacon is one that stands out a lot. I don't know if I like glue stick, but it's not the worst one I've heard. And also not inherently wrong. I love the barbecue references that we're getting here. There was a time where we had a barbecue sauce that we used in our restaurant that had Campfire as part of the base for the barbecue sauce. It was arguably too popular, to the point where we basically realized that we were going to have to keep bottling it or start bottling it if we kept making it. So we pivoted to a slightly different one that's more bourbon based.
We're going to have to bump up our production of whiskey just to keep up with this barbecue sauce.
Yeah. And though I am probably not supposed to say this, I do love cooking with Campfire. It is a bit pricey, obviously, to cook with, but it is fantastic with barbecue. It is fantastic with any like mushroom based dish. I have cooked like deglazed mushrooms with Campfire many times with incredible results. It
Ooh,
also makes one of the best hot toddies you'll ever have.
I
The
could see that.
sweetness of the sweetness of the bourbon, the spice of the rye, and the smoke on the nose is just it's perfect. It's wonderful.
It's more cough syrup coming up.
The
Yeah.
most traditional cough syrup, right?
Yeah.
And I'm a Scotch whiskey lover, right? Like you heard me mention my experience in Scotland a couple times here, and so to me, Campfire really is this combination of like the whiskey of my home with the whiskey that made me fall in love with whiskey, and then the most popular American whiskey, all kind of together in one glass, and um, I love it. I think it's an amazing product. It is of the core four products, the one that sells the least, but it is also the one that has the
Well,
most kind of dedicated fans. Like people who drink Campfire,
yes.
that's what they drink. There if Campfire is your whiskey, there's a very, very, very short list of spirits in the world that can scratch that same itch. You
Well, yeah,
know,
there's not many people that are blending those three spirits together, period. So,
yeah.
no, it is very cool. But I could see why it's not as popular, only because American whiskey drinkers want bourbon.
Mhm.
And most of the time they don't even want rye. If you put it in a good cocktail, okay. But it's definitely not the first thing that they think of. It's ultimately bourbon. But for a Scotch drinker, this is a, if they didn't know any better, this is a bourbon they could drink, right? Because they
Mhm.
got a little bit of Scotch in it. It's smoky and complex and beautiful. And now I just want to go and saute some mushrooms and deglaze them and see how that
Mhm.
tastes.
It's really
Um,
it works really well. It brings out like the earthiness of the mushrooms, but the sweetness of the bourbon keeps it
yeah,
from turning into just like this like total like earthy bomb. It's very
right.
cool combo.
Yeah, no, I could see that. Uh, it's absolutely awesome. And this is cheese stock. Um, this is why we love you. Your blending skills are fantastic. This is I know we all have our favorites when it comes to High West. Um, for me, it's been the Campfire for a long time
It's a
because
really
it doesn't have
it's a
cheese.
special whiskey. And I like what you were saying about that too, where like to me, Campfire is showcasing all the things that make us great. And I think most notably what we do with blending. You know, to get the smoke to come through the way it does without overpowering everything else that's going in there is an incredibly delicate balance. And I think the Campfire is a whiskey that, as we've grown, has actually gotten better because we've gotten better at blending. And I think this whiskey is really kind of a barometer for how good our blending program is. And to do a little callback, you know, and you've heard me say this probably a couple times now. And if you ever come to High West and see me, you'll hear it again. You know, when you open a distillery in Utah, uh, when like I will tell you, when I first heard High West was opening, I was in school in Colorado at the time, and I thought this was a terrible idea. As somebody who grew up in Utah, I thought the idea of opening a whiskey distillery here was a really, really good way of throwing money out the door. Right.
Right.
Very happy to say I was wrong about that. But I think one of the things that makes High West who we are is that we are very willing to break unwritten rules. If it's a law, we will abide by it. But if it's just a thing that we don't do or somebody doesn't do, just because you've never done that, we're not in Kentucky, right? They have all these traditions and all these years and years of history. We're in Utah, right? We've been around for less than 20 years, and so for us, breaking unwritten rules, I think, is a lot of what got us to where we are. And Campfire is that in a bottle.
Right. Yeah. Is there any plans in your future to make your own peated single malts?
So funny thing, we actually have made peated malt whiskey at High West before. Um,
Ooh,
at this point, it has only ever made it into the early blends of the high country. I
okay.
know we have whiskey sitting in barrels, peated whiskey sitting in barrels.
Okay.
I don't know what we're planning on doing with it.
Fair
I
enough.
would be very surprised if it ended up becoming the peated component in Campfire. But I was, also surprised when we distilled peated malt in the first place. I was surprised when we did a bottled bond rye whiskey as our first 100% High West release of a rye whiskey, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah. Did that sell
uh,
out like locally? Because I haven't seen that out there.
which one?
The bottled and bond.
Oh yeah, so that one right now is only a High West release.
Yeah, that's right.
We still have some locally, but we just did a very small release. We'll be doing a second release that's kind of a smaller release, but like nationally in the U.S., not to every state. I think just to control states. And then we are going to be doing with our third release, the Bottle to Bond, which will be at the beginning of next year. It's going to hit full distribution, is my understanding of the plan
Okay.
with that one. Yeah.
A question from the chat. Are
Mm-hmm.
wheated bourbons on the way?
So it's kind of a two-part answer. One is we have distilled wheated bourbon. It is sitting in barrels. What that's going to become, well, that for one thing is a decision that's above my pay grade, but it is, going back to when we at High West with whiskey, we really let it tell us what it's going to be. So that wheated bourbon, it does exist. It's sitting in barrels. When it's going to find its way into a bottle and when you're going to see some, I have no idea.
That's fair. That's fair. Um, I really enjoyed this lineup, and if you haven't noticed, Evan has shot the poll up into the chat.
Mm-hmm.
4 questions this time. He's feeling like he's making up for the times where he's forgot a poll, adding 4 questions into this one. So what are your first and second favorites on the core whiskey? What's your favorite limited edition? And which high bottle do you want to see next in Alberta? This is for Rez and Vish if you're listening. Prisoner share, come on. That would be amazing. Just I would love to see the Boo Rye come back,
Mm-hmm.
which is very cool. Um, I had somebody ask me in person earlier today what happened to Prairie Bourbon, the Prairie whiskey. That's now just bourbon. They've just
Mm-hmm.
renamed it. It's just not Prairie anymore. So still available, just a different name.
Yep. Same blend. Same blend.
Yeah, yeah, very cool. Um, Well, I'm sure, Austin, you have to say you like all of them.
Yes.
And because you're,
Legally.
yes, but I would, in my words, I would guess that the Campfire is probably your favorite just because of that peated element and how much you love the peated whiskey because of what we talked about. But if I'm wrong, please correct me. I'd love to be wrong.
It's a good thought, and it is one of my favorites. But my favorite is the single malt. Actually,
Is it? Very cool.
I love that whiskey. I love the barley presence in it. I love the banana bread note. And I think there's an element to it as well that is just personal catharsis of
Yeah.
having a whiskey that is 100% High West. Because I started at High West when we were still just a blender, right? And
Right.
so for the first ever 100% in-house release to be something that I truly love, there's like not to be sappy, but there's even like an emotional connection to that whiskey where it's just, to me, it's an anniversary every year of like, this is to me when we really became High West Distillery, right? This is when everything kind of coalesced. Um, but Campfire is right up there as well, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Jeff says release a weeded whiskey and call it Jackalope. Just free suggestions for your business there.
Well, unfortunately or fortunately, we've already used up our jackalope design for the Boo Rye, but
Yeah.
I do like that idea.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, this high country is really nice.
It's subtle, it's not a big, aggressive, oily, peaty
No.
single malt, but I think it does. I like it too because it to me is a distinctly American single malt, which, as you said, is a severely underserved category.
Hmm.
And so I really love that whiskey. To me, it is, I don't know, it's just a really great example of this like kind of style that's really never came back after Prohibition and is just now starting to get its due. Fun fact about us, actually, our one of our founders, Jane of David Jane Perkins, her family actually owned Rochester Distilling Company in upstate New York before Prohibition.
Mm.
And they were one of the largest producers of malt whiskey in the United States before Prohibition. Uh,
Cool. So is the malt whiskey something that she was kind of pushing for as a a renaissance to her heritage, or?
that's a good question. I know that the name High Country Single Malt has been owned by High West for a long time, so I know that that was always part of the plan. Um, and I don't know how much that was Jane's family history, how much of it was Brendan's degree, and how much of it was Dave's just like love of Scotch whiskey. But I
Yeah.
imagine Jane had a lot to do with that.
I'm sure there was some pillow talk being done at home. Cool. So everybody voted today, which is unusual.
Love to
Um,
see that.
yeah. So first favorite of the core, Campfire for the most votes, but then a tie for the two Ryes, Double and Rendezvous. Second favorite, wow, a three-way tie. Double Rye, Rendezvous, Campfire. I love it. High Country with some votes as well. Favorite limited edition, Midwinter's just crushed it. And then another Prisoners for limited, we want to see for five, and then a three-way tie again on the other one. So, I mean, it just overall looks like High West uh, has a fan following here in Alberta or Canada, at least, because we've got people all over Canada on this call today. Um, I want to thank you, Austin, for giving us your time and stories and sharing in this today. Thank you, Reza, for helping organize this, and to all of you who took the time to join me on this tasting. I really enjoyed it. It was nice to visit High West again in a vertical, which is something I haven't had the pleasure of doing before. So thank you all very much. Um, I think we'll end it there and just go off and enjoy your the rest of your evening. If you guys want a bottle, email me. I'm happy to help you out. And in the meantime, thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers, guys. Thank you so much for having me. And well, cheers. Enjoy some more High West in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Austin. This is great.